Hi, welcome back to Metamorphosis Medicine. I'm Dr. Lauren Kaczynski, and I thought I would share today a talk that I was invited to give at the Auburn University Physician Executive MBA program 25th Jubilee reunion last week. And it wasn't recorded, so I'm just going to record it now because I think this serves as a long but good introduction to some of the ideas about what metamorphosis medicine is and why it exists. So here we go. The topic of the talk was rebalancing the three priorities of medicine and other magic. And what was exciting to me about being with this group of people at the Physician Executive MBA program is that these are doctors who already have, for one reason or another, taken some action to broaden the terms of their own definition of what it is to be a doctor. So many of the people in this group, it's a really interesting MBA program. I'll make another short video about it. But many of the people in the group are either not doing any direct clinical care at all or doing a hybrid. Some people are doing different kinds of administrative jobs, some of which they never thought they would do, but have provided, as you would expect, some insight into doctors and our work in ways that they might not have seen had they not done those things. And a lot of people are just doing clinical work, but the perspective afforded by the program has given them a broader view of what they're doing. I found it to be a really accepting and really very interesting group of people, and I was delighted to have a chance to be there. So, with that in mind, the talk opens with a small experience, and I think those of you who are watching this as a video should do this too. And what I'm asking you for is to listen to each of two soundscapes. They're about 45 seconds each. It's not very long. And what I'd like you to do is just register what you feel in your body, or whether it stimulates a certain thought or a memory. Whatever registers with you with it, just make note. And if you'd like to, in between the two soundscapes and after the second one, make a note or two, jot something down, then you might want to turn this off and grab a piece of paper so that you can do that. And we'll come back to this at the end of the presentation. So here we go. When the ground babies can't stand activity, and it's natural reaction for them to push the limit. No pretend, but we're all kings and queens that manifest our own royalty from our dreams. Beautiful scenes of our story, plot twist, waking up, deja vu don't exist. But Tyson never spoke with a list, and Santa Claus looked like Bruce Pearl carrying wise gifts. A bunch of fly kicks for the family to slide in, waking up to a whip only justice can ride in. No such things as weakness and side chicks when I can easily trust them. I do my way quick. Grab a couple meals, book bags, make sense. I'm getting kind of hungry. I'm gonna need all my strength so I can damn lift all the trauma through these rips. They give you a star on stage to bust those clip. Bill Perry on the keys. And then taking a moment to register or jot down a few words about that soundscape for you. And then we'll move into the next soundscape. And again, taking a moment to register any sensation, memories, whatever came across your mental screen in the second soundscape. So, about 10 years ago, I had a conversation with a friend in which I was describing what I found so compelling about a career in medicine, why I thought this was a really great choice. And I didn't know it at the time that these would become the three priorities, but this is at least the first iteration of them. So the first thing that I said was that I wanted financial security. And as the daughter of a single mother, it was clear to me from very early in life that having a way to support myself and my family was really important. And secondly came intellectual stimulation. Now, I've had some kind of a job since I was 12, and I've been on my own since I was 15. So you can imagine that I did a lot of unskilled labor kinds of work through my middle teens until I taught myself how to type, and then supported myself through college doing office work, which was a step up. It was easier work, even if more mentally demanding. And I had an epiphany one day. A lot of the work that I did was things like dishwashing, short order cook. I did laundry for a while. I did a lot of landscaping work, and I did an awful lot of cleaning. And this epiphany came on a day when I was doing probably my least favorite job. A real low moment was cleaning the urinals in a public men's room. And I don't have to regale you with the details to know why that was so aggravating. But I realized on that day that if I did this job the best that I could with my whatever intention I had for creating a space that was fresh and refreshed for people, that it transformed it, that there was an intrinsic good to the work that didn't have anything to do with the value other people assigned to it, or the fact that men would come in and urinate there all over the place again. It just had to do with me and how I approached things. And this was huge. And it's helped me a lot at different times in my life. But I also recognized that since it seemed likely I would be working all of my adult life, that it would be helpful to me to have work that was intellectually stimulating, work that I looked forward to going to, and where I felt that I was engaged in problem solving or doing things that I was excited about. And medicine held that both in the biology studies, but also in the and physiology and pathophysiology and all of that, but also in things like anthropology. So this also seemed like something that would never run out, that there would always be new dimensions to this through the course of a career. And that also felt pretty exciting. And the third thing that I said was meaningful work. This ends up being a much more vague category, even though all of us have to say something about this and even have done some things to demonstrate our commitment to this dimension of doctoring. And to me, what I thought at the time was that if, in addition to being intellectually stimulated, I also felt that I was working on things that reflected my values or that made me feel that I was contributing in bigger ways to society, that was going to just be exponentially better. So he said, well, Lauren, that's like a professional trifecta. And I was like, yeah, I know. And then we both looked at each other and said, how come so many physicians are miserable and complaining about this? And I'm like, yeah, right. What's going on? And I started to think about using this this trifecta as a way of investigating exactly what's going on. So I'm sorry, in this Loom presentation, my video overlies this first slide a little bit, but the first thing that came to my mind was the physician Facebook page that's got over 100,000 physician members, and it's physician side gigs. And the idea is to find more ways to extract as much financial return from medicine as possible, and then also to look for side gigs that kind of make life more satisfying as a complement to what happens in medicine. I'm not at all opposed to or unaccepting of the idea that some people get to medicine and realize they did it for all the wrong reasons. Like maybe they were trying to satisfy ancestral or family desires and it really didn't suit them at all. And they were just smart and capable and could, so they did. But I think what happens with a lot of people is that our hearts are broken in a number of different ways. And we start to doubt ourselves and what called us, and then start to think there's going to be other work that does better, does more than this. So I have some things to say about that because I think this pertains to the question of rebalancing priorities and what happens to us along the way that interferes with our ability to get the most satisfaction out of the work of being a doctor as possible. But I also thought, is this also a little bit of the grass is greener on the other side? Because how many other professional opportunities or work opportunities are there going to be that offer the same three things that medicine does? And what would happen if these 100,000 people, instead of looking for something they thought was going to be better, turned all that creative energy and attention and desire back to medicine and said, what has to happen here in order for me to live the dream that I had? So this is one question. The next thing that I had in mind was that I knew even then that about half of practicing physicians, so 1 in 2, is going to run out of gas at some point during our career and have an episode of burnout that maybe we never really fully come back from, that we're disappointed and much more guarded in what we give of ourselves to the work because of that. And so for this reason, too, it seemed important to look at and try to think about what's going on at a deeper level in our work than just responding to what the outer world presents to us. I also heard an increasing number of people say, and have said myself from time to time, I didn't sign up for this. Now, what does this mean? I mean, it begs the question, not just of what we didn't sign up for, but what we did sign up for. And it's been my experience that trying to get doctors to explain not just what we do as doctors, but why and how it's only a layer or two deep. There's not, for as much time and energy as we expend on this, and as important as it is, most people are not all that articulate about these questions. Now, I will also say that I don't remember hearing this very much when I started in medical school in the beginning years of my clinical exposure. And it seems to me that this has increased kind of at the inflection point where more physicians became employed rather than being the employers. So, for example, at the beginning of my career, the medical staff still ran the hospital. This was in the bylaws, and the medical staff employed administrators who reported to them. So when all of that changed, when the bylaws were gutted, when physicians decided that there was some advantages to being employed rather than being the employers, and administrative presences took over the management of the hospitals and doctors became employees. I think this happened. I don't have data to support it, but that feels like the increase of this. And maybe the most important coherent question I had in all of this was how it was that a group of people who are as gifted, motivated, dedicated, hardworking, well-educated, often technically skillful people could feel so, well, I used to say like losing power and even so how could a group of people who are this motivated, inspired, intelligent, well-educated, hardworking, really dedicated, and often with a phenomenal skill set, end up feeling not only like we're lacking in power and increasingly invisible, but also even victims in the systems of care in which ostensibly the work that we provide is the centerpiece. We're the key personnel. We're not the only people, and we need other people to work with, but the whole thing doesn't cohere. COVID wouldn't have been treated if doctors hadn't shown up for work. All the frontline workers were important, but somebody needed to figure out what treatments to give when we didn't have a regimen that was appropriate, and to figure out that our application of an improvisation based on other similar illnesses was in fact detrimental. You know, all of that required the at the bedside reasoning capacities of physicians. So some of our best qualities were required for that. So how does this get to be that we feel this way? Well, I think this is not unrelated to my last observation at this point, which is that physicians have for a long time been trying to outsource responsibility for our happiness and our work to non-physicians. A very little bit of this makes sense when it pertains to initiatives that are set in place by the people who are now administrators and employ the physician workforce, because they're responsible for those things. But the whole definition of a profession is that our experience, our education, our training, our expertise is so specialized that without that, you can't know what it's like to do the work or even make judgments about the quality of the work. This has set up all kinds of problems in the current formulation with industrial healthcare, because the efforts to routinize the work, like making an assembly line so that things are predictable, but also to determine metrics that are figured out from the outside to establish the value of medical care, is a little bit at a loss with, or in frank contradiction to this definition of a profession. And the more we give away of that, the more we make ourselves dependent on things external to our profession. So I think these things are tied together in a way that I hope will get a little clearer as I continue in this talk. So at the outset, I just want to talk about differences between what I call the medicine OS and the industrial healthcare OS, because this creates the context in which these three priorities play out and are either imbalanced or get rebalanced. And so I think the first distinction I want to make is that medicine is relational and industrial healthcare is transactional. So what do I mean by relational? Well, it means being more concerned with the connections between the dots than the dots themselves, and being concerned about how the connections between the dots both change the whole system, but also maybe change how we think about the dots, the individual parts too. There's something relational about it. So if we think about this on a microcosmic level and think about a defining feature of life, it's that things that are alive are self-organizing. Now, there's some interesting exceptions to that, like crystals self-organize. And I don't know that they meet other criteria for being considered to be alive. But once we're talking about self-organizing, we automatically invoke that there's some sort of a repair mechanism, that there's an innate capacity for healing. Because to maintain that architecture, to maintain that relational state, requires also that there be some component of being able to correct when there are inborn errors or perturbations from the outside that disturb that architecture. Now, this also is necessary in order to propagate or to extend the existence of a given microcosmic system. So we also, though, need to be able to sustain certain changes that are adaptive. And some of that is by accident, of course, that things accumulate or are missed by the surveillance or the innate healing capacity. But this combination of being able to make repair and also allow for change is kind of like transformation. So that's at the microcosmic level. If we think about this happening at the macrocosmic level, like at the level of people or of a society, a lot of the same things are at work. And this innate healing capacity is true within each individual, but also there are entities that exist or whose purpose is to help maintain that integrity of individual systems. So we might even think of the role of doctors being a lot like the enzymes that travel along a strand of nucleic acid and help to restore balance and make repair. And certainly there are things that we can think of at a larger level too. So the reason why I'm taking pains to discuss this is to introduce in this context the notion of archetype, because it helps to make a connection between what might be biological function, at least as we understand it, and the story or motif that we live with and function through that has some relationship to that motif. This is really what Carl Jung meant when he introduced the idea of archetype. And I'll just mention now that Carl Jung was a contemporary of Freud's. He's considered one of the founding thinkers of psychiatry and psychology. And a lot of the concepts that he introduced you'll be familiar with because they've been absorbed into or integrated into ordinary conversation. And they're things like a collective unconscious, and actually he did one of the very first experiments called the word association experiment, which helped to demonstrate in a more objective scientific fashion the presence of unconscious thinking. Introversion and extroversion are his concepts. He talked about psychological types, which was absorbed into or adapted to become personality types. The notion of a complex, of individuation or midlife crisis, and personal myth. These are some of the things that Carl Jung talked about. Let me give you another example of archetype, because he thought of archetypes as almost instinctual capacities or categories of experience that then would get filled with particular expressions according to time, culture, place. So lots of people using this word today think that of it as a fixed proposition across time and culture. That's not what Jung thought. So the other example that I wanted to provide, just to give you a sense of this and why this healing capacity, this healing function, or this self-organizing idea might be rooted not just in a fairy tale that we tell ourselves in today's age, but actually almost a biological yearning. I'm going to say it that way. So if we think about mammals, by definition, every mammal has a mother. Every mammal develops, occurs, and then develops inside its mother, and then is delivered or separated out into the world as a separate individual. So however that pattern gets dealt with and expressed with assignments to what's a good mother, what's a bad mother. So like a nurturing mother versus a devouring or consuming mother who doesn't ever let the child really fully separate into its own individual person. What that looks like and how that plays out is very different over time and place. But somehow or another, we might assume that we all have built into us, almost at the level of template or blueprint, at a cellular level, some information about this lineage of how we're created. That's an archetype. So in this relational medicine operating system, here are things that I associate then with this, and you'll hear echoes of this kind of archetypal sensibility through this. It's a millennia-old practice, or practices that help people to exist, to live the richest, fullest, most integrated expression of ourselves possible. I want to just pause here for a minute, because this definition of medicine for me has been derived from all the medical anthropology and sociology classes that I took when I was younger, through all of my career, my master's thesis, which was about the creation of personhood in medical encounters. But it's been very difficult to come up with one sentence that I think summarizes most generally and completely what medicine is. This is not the same as industrial healthcare. Medicine is concerned with self-organization, integration, equilibrium, repair, restoration, quality of life, lineage, transformation, evolution, and capacity, like functional capacity. It employs wisdom, observation, experience, and reason to help attain these things. And it recognizes that it's nearly impossible to cultivate integrity without having integrity. In other words, by integrity, I mean this both on the physical plane, but also characterologically. And I think oftentimes these things are ideas about what we're doing as well as what we're doing. They share a lineage and a motif in this archetypal sense. And it's hard for us to recognize restoration of integrity of other people when we're not honoring and attending to the restoration or maintenance of our own integrity. So here are some archetypal kinds of images that we might associate with these thoughts. Healer, alchemist, magician, shaman, sorceress, witch, great mother. And as with all archetypes, there's always a constructive and a destructive capacity in them. Nothing is ever all good or all bad, at least not in Jung's formulation. And I would have to agree that this is most resonant with my experience in life and with my inner self, as well as my experience of other people. So I think these are some of the ideas that we brought with us that we end up almost shaming over time because it seems sort of magical, or there's a lot of evidence, that so-called evidence, that we encounter along the way that these things were childish or naive ideas. So we'll keep talking about this. What this view has made me do is see medicine and being in medicine as a call to a lineage that is standing in a river of time. And this industrial healthcare phenomenon is a blip on the time scale. And in the natural order of, if you will, what medicine is and where it arises from and what it's seeking to accomplish, not just for humans, but the other than humans too, I believe, have elements of this in their own way and experience. So to move now into a somewhat more contemporary discussion of this, I want to talk about it as being, medicine as being pro-social and relational, even though I'm still going to say here this funny thing invokes the power of healing presence, but let me make a case for that. And I'm going to tap into Dan Siegel's interpersonal neurobiology. He's not the only person who identifies as this, and talk a little bit about attachment theory. So Dr. Dan Siegel is an MD who is a neurologist and pediatric psychiatrist, but whose work over time has evolved to this field called interpersonal neurobiology. And one of the primary questions of this is the brain synonymous with the mind? Are they the same thing? And for the last few decades, it's been very popular to say that the mind, that thought, is just the product of neurochemical interactions and synaptic connections in the brain. But there are a couple of things that argue against this and which have led to this theory of interpersonal neurobiology, and that which supposes that the brain is something that it is shaped and exists between us. And one idea is that what we think can actually rewire our brain. This has been shown. So it's not just that the brain determines what we think, but what we think also determines the brain. And now there's some evidence that even our microbiome, the organisms that live in and on us, have some capacity to participate in this process too. And there's beginning to be discussion among neurologists about the peripherally distributed central nervous system. In other words, the brain, this is sort of a Copernican revolution in a way, but the brain may not be the headquarters that we've thought of it as being completely. So part of how Dan Siegel got to this was through his early exposure to beginning work in attachment theory. And a lot of people understand something about attachment theory now. And many may have heard of it in connection with adverse childhood events or ACEs studies. But attachment theory has observed that there are 4 different patterns of attachment. In other words, the relationship between small children and our parent or primary caregivers that help to determine how we experience ourselves, how we begin to develop ways of relating to our own experiences. So to self-regulate, self-organize, but also that begin to determine and can for a lifetime have consequences for how we what relationships we find ourselves in and how we conduct them later on. So the good news is that even though it's not uncommon to have negative or even harmful attachments when we're young, it's also possible to recover from them because we have plasticity here too, provided that we're aware of what the issues are and that we take corrective measures with ourselves to understand what's happened. So I want to show a short video that is of the still face experiment, which is just 2 to 3 minutes, but I think it helps to convey a lot about, on a different level, on the not just listening to my words level, about what we mean by secure attachment.
Babies this young are extremely responsive to the emotions and the reactivity and the social interaction that they get from the world around them. This is something that we started studying 30, 40 years ago, when people didn't think that infants could engage in social interaction. In this still face experiment, what the mother did was she sits down and she's playing with her baby, who's about a year of age.
Like a girl. Oh.
And she gives a greeting to the baby gives a greeting back to her.
Yeah.
This baby starts pointing at different places in the world, and the mother's trying to engage her and play with her. They're working to coordinate their emotions and their intentions, what they want to do in the world. And that's really what the baby is used to. And then we ask the mother to not respond to the baby. The baby very quickly picks up on this. And then she uses all of her abilities to try and get the mother back. She smiles at the mother. She points because she's used to the mother looking where she points. The baby puts both hands up in front of her and says, "What's happening here?" She makes that screechy sound at the mother, like, "Come on, why aren't we doing this?" Even in this 2 minutes, when they don't get the normal reaction, they react with negative emotions. They turn away. They feel the stress of it. They actually may lose control of their posture because of the stress that they're experiencing.
Okay. I'm here. And what are you doing? Oh, yes. Oh, what a big girl.
It's a little like the good, the bad, and the ugly. The good is that normal stuff that goes on, that we all do with our kids. The bad is when something bad happens, but the infant can overcome it. After all, when you stop the still face, the mother and the baby start to play again. The ugly is when you don't give the child any chance to get back to the good. There's no reparation, and they're stuck in that really ugly situation.
So it turns out that this still face experiment was repeated with fathers, and I didn't have time to show this when I was giving my talk, but I think I'll include it here as well because something different happens when we see things than when we hear about them.
What we've learned over the years is that babies are much more capable than we initially imagined, but they're also much more vulnerable. And in Edtronic's still face experiment, we get to see both in a very short period. We see the baby and the dad playing together in their routines. There are things that they know about each other and things that they do together, and it's fun. And then we ask the dad to turn away, and when he turns back, to keep his face completely still and not respond to the baby. And the results are almost immediate, and they're devastating. The baby looks to the dad and tries to get the dad to get back into those games. Hey, we were just playing just a minute ago, weren't we? We were having fun. What's going on? And then the baby starts to get frustrated when that doesn't work. So she'll have to look away and look around the room and find something else and then look back and say, now can we play? And within 3 minutes, the baby has really dissolved. She is trying to get out of the chair. She's uncomfortable. She's reaching out to Dad. She's crying. And then we ask the dad to turn away again. And when he turns back, to go back to being regular dad. And it's a joyous reunion. They get back into their routines, the things that they do together, the things that they were just doing 3 minutes before. And the baby settles down and gets back to the comfort zone that she's developed with the dad. What we see in the still face experiment is how able the child is to initiate and be part of the relationship between the father and the child, but also how much she depends on that relationship in order to keep an even keel. And when she's grounded and comfortable, she can explore the world. She can meet new people. She can try new things, and she's got that safe base that she can always rely on. And there's a trust level there. We can only begin to imagine what it's like for babies whose life is like that 3 minutes all of the time. And they don't get that responsiveness, and they don't get any help getting back to an even keel. And the results can be very tragic. They can have trouble trusting people. They can have trouble relating to people. And they can have trouble being calm enough so that they can explore the world and take part in the world. So we know that those initial relationships, that initial responsiveness and interaction between the father and the baby are keys to the baby's success as a child and as an adult.
So in addition to these behavioral challenges, there are also some brain development impairments that happen when we're in adverse or traumatic attachment situations when we're young. But from this video, you can maybe imagine now how healing presence is constituted through engagement, through attention, through the presence of another person. And we have this capacity as physicians too, and may not always realize it. I wanted to share a story from the second year of my surgery residency. When I was new on a service, I readmitted a woman who'd had gallstone pancreatitis and came back with necrotizing pancreatitis. And fortunately, she was doing very well, but she still had a need for serial abdominal operations and debridements of the pancreas, and she had a big open abdominal incision. She was a large woman, and so her the depth of her incision was probably almost 20 centimeters. And I was responsible through the month that I was on service with her for doing at least one of her wet to dry dressing changes a day so I could take a look at things. So of course, during the course of her admission, I helped to make her diagnosis, and then seeing her through this month, when it was time for me to rotate off service, I stopped by to talk with her about it being the end of my time and who was coming next. And this woman was stalwart. She was like the organizer in the plumbing business, where she was the office manager, and even in her home, she was the person who helped everything cohere. And she had a lot of worries during her month in the hospital about how things were going to go. Her husband was very quiet. He might have been a drinker. Anyway, I was aware of these things because I spent so much time in her room. But after she wished me well and told me what a great doctor she thought I was and was going to become, she dissolved into tears when I waited just a moment. And I was a little surprised. But then she said, "You've been my pillar of strength, and I'm not sure how I'll go on." Well, I had no idea that she was leaning into me that way or had imbued me with that capacity. I was blown away by how stoic she was, and really understood that the hard work was what she was doing, that the healing was happening through her and in her. Well, it changed everything for me to understand how sometimes people can require us without our knowing it, that they need us to hold things for them when they feel a loss of their own integrity, and that we become a substitute for that just by our consistency, our presence, and our care. We're the assurance. It's very important to know, and it seems in such short supply these days, the confidence or the awareness that when we talk with patients or with them, that this is also what's happening. So let's turn now to talk more about transactional industrial healthcare. And here are 3 thoughts that I have about how that works. And it's interesting because I came up with these I really articulated them last fall. And then this spring, when I've been taking a business essentials course at the London School of Economics, because I felt like I needed a bit more language about, well, my own business, but also what I'm engaged with. And it turns out this is sort of what the value proposition of a company or a firm is. First is to extract as much wealth from medicine with the least investment of resources possible. The second is to exploit cultural values that make medicine an almost limitlessly deep pocket. And third is to distribute the gains asymmetrically, favoring the architects of industry. So I want to pause here for a moment, because this aspect of the limitlessly deep pocket, there's a second layer of this too, which a very smart medical student said to me also about 10 years ago when I was talking about where money accumulates around medicine. And he said, well, wherever there's a concentration of talent, there are going to be people who array themselves around that to try to profit from that. And of course, he was thinking about athletics. But I think some of the same principles apply here. But there's this other layer that's not just about entertainment or fueling a sense of belonging and competition, but really about this core concern or value that we place on life and on functionality and on living without pain as much as possible. And as far as item 3 is concerned, there are really interesting things that are happening to temper this some, not necessarily that I've seen within medicine itself, although there might be some posturing a little bit about it. But I think benefits corporations have been designed to help with the distribution question, and to be able to consider more fully the opinions of stakeholders, not just stockholders, and also to consider the environment as an element that in the effort, whatever that is. And then there's a woman whose name is Jacqueline Novogratz, who started a foundation called Acumen, and she's trying to figure out some ways to address poverty, but by fusing the best aspects of capitalism and some of the important things about charitable work, but without the negative aspects of charity, the disempowering aspects of charity. So I think there is work that's going on that's credible, that tries to bring these things together in a better way, but I don't actually see that this is what characterizes most of what's happening in industrial healthcare. And I also want to say that I have never heard a doctor claim to own patient lives, but I've heard this quite often. It's standard language in industrial healthcare, both in health systems and even more in third-party payers. So let's talk about the archetypal dimensions of this transactional industrial healthcare. So here are some of the images that come to mind for me: leader, sovereign, king, provider. It's important. There are aspects of, and we doctors turn to business in order to help organize things in a way that enabled us to provide. And I think a lot of people who gravitate to business have some of these ideas in mind. There's also a little bit of the trickster, like Hermes or Loki, and strategist, the playing a game or trying to amass things for one's own satisfaction or pleasure of the game. And then there are merchants, and I also want to say something about hoarding. And certainly Gollum's preoccupation with power for the sake of power and greed for the sake of greed is one aspect of hoarding, which often in psychodynamic terms represents a feeling of lack and fear. But, squirrels hoard for the winter. So in all of these too, there are positive and negative, or constructive and destructive potentials in these archetypes. Before we move on to the 3 priorities, I want to just reference the mathematics of complex systems. And it's just a reference to bring this motif in as a way for thinking about the balance among and within each of these 3 priorities. And so this is an infographic about an ecological system that I poached from the internet. Here's the reference for it. But it's a pretty good representation of how I understand a complex system as one that has is an open system. In other words, that the myriad elements of the system are free to move in and out of the system and free to interact with one another. And then under those circumstances, there's a mathematical relationship that's described that explains the emergence of a higher order of integration of these parts, and even specialization of the myriad parts. And provided that these properties are met, that it's an open system and there's free communication among the individual elements and the specialized parts, that there's an even higher level of organization that develops among these parts, and capacity that develops. So we can think of this in the terms of an individual, like a human body, and also society or an ecosystem. So when the system is closed, or when free communication between the elements is restricted, this falls apart. This doesn't work, and there's not harmonious integration of the parts into a higher level of function. And instead, as Dan Siegel would say about mental health, because he would characterize mental health as being this kind of situation where all the constituent parts of our psyche, the physical sensation, how we integrate them, and so on, when those are free to interact, then we end up in a state of harmonious flow. But when they're not, when the system is either closed or there's not free communication, we tend to end up either in states of chaos, sort of tending towards things like schizophrenia, or rigidity, things like obsessive compulsive disorder. Same things can happen in other systems. So I want you to imagine for a moment a rat in a cage in a laboratory, and there are 3 canisters that the rat can feed from, and these are filled with the 3 priorities. So there's something yummy and nutritious in just the right formulation to fulfill each of these priorities. And we're going to make a lot of assumptions in this system. We're going to assume that the rat, left to her own devices, will feed freely and in exactly the right combination for each of the 3 canisters to achieve her best sense of well-being, her optimal well-being. So she won't overeat, she won't undereat, and it may be similar to the distribution for other rats, but maybe not exactly the same because she's herself. And then each of these canisters has a working bar and has the right food in it that's maintained in full supply, that doesn't go bad and isn't replaced with something that's either toxic or bad tasting to the rat. Now, I made this note here about the weak sister. Often meaningful work, as I mentioned out front, is kind of considered the most expendable part of this trio. So if we have limited resource or capacity, we might start to see this as the thing that gets jettisoned. This is unfortunate because I've come to think of this as really our superpower, because it's what's in this domain that transforms what's in the other domains into medicine. So it's what takes technological innovation and makes it medicine. It's what tempers some of the financial concerns and makes doctors say things like, it's not about the money, even though sometimes it seems it's only about the money. But we'll talk about how some of that happens. And so it's interesting to me that we end up kind of abandoning the meaningful work part, or seeing it as naive and a problem. let's go through these a little bit more carefully. And of course, I can't say everything about all of them. I'm just going to suggest some things in each one to whet your appetite or get you thinking a little bit about how this might work for you. So let's begin with intellectual stimulation. And I want to start by saying that allopathic medicine kind of made a pact with the devil in a way by its promise of predictability. So at a time over the last couple of hundred years when allopathic medicine was attempting to distinguish itself from and gain hegemony over the other forms of healing arts that were in practice and had been for a long, long time, we made the claim that we make more accurate diagnoses and that we have more efficacious treatments for those things that we diagnose, and that we have a better capacity to predict the outcome of a particular condition. Now, all of this turns out to be true, but it doesn't turn out to be true as broadly as we might like to imagine. So in other words, in the spectrum of human ailments, the ones that we can diagnose reliably, treat effectively without bad side effects, and achieve predictable outcomes is actually pretty narrow. And we're particularly lost if there are conditions that in which there's a complex interaction of things that determines the clinical picture and outcome. We do better with our scientific model with having one problem that has one solution. And in fact, when there's not just one solution, when it's going to take a treatment plan or a spectrum of things, we're much less good at even being able to fund research that's like that because we don't know how to think about it. Now, having increasing complex data analysis capacity will help improve this. But even so, there's currently research into the microbiome as that's gained legitimacy in allopathic medicine as a potential explanatory factor in our health and illness. There's an effort with the colorectal cancer to find the one bad organism. And my suspicion is that it's never going to prove to be one bad organism. It's going to end up being the balance of the organisms that are there, and whether there's an imbalance that happens that favors one or more organisms that then contributes to the condition. But to blame the one organism is an old-fashioned way of thinking that I think we are finding is meeting its limitations. Now, there are some unintended consequences to this. Well, actually, let me say one more thing before I move on to that. The problem with assuming this mindset that this is what we promise is not only wrong, it has some unintended consequences. So the unintended consequences are, first of all, that we set up expectations for patients so that when we don't meet those expectations, we meet with a lot of disappointment and stress. And we're not very good at talking about it. Part of the reason we're not very good at talking about it is because we don't see the whole picture ourselves, and we've bought into it ourselves too and think just about perfect will do. Well, we can strive for that, but it's not, we're always going to be overmatched. And so this idea that somehow there's going to be a time or a place where we're not overmatched by mystery, by what we don't know, is false. It also means that we tend not to see some of the downsides of the things that we prescribe and do. And that happens in part because we think there's no alternative. And so we accept the risk profile of things. But I think that there's another place of downplaying some of that that's part of not reckoning with our uncertainty and fallibility in a better way. Okay, so that's one piece. The other piece is that it tends to set us up in an oppositional relationship with our patients. And I have to thank Dr. Rana Oddish and her memoir, In Shock, that describes her experience as a doctor and a patient who had a devastating medical event in the third trimester of her first pregnancy. And she hears things that doctors say while they're caring for her, things that they think she can't hear or doesn't hear, even when they're said in front of her, and she's quite with it. But she also recognizes these as things she's said, and she's thoughtful about what all that means and what her role is as a patient. And something different starts to happen in her relationship with doctors. But at the very beginning of the story, as she's going under anesthesia, She can hear and see what's happening in the room, despite the fact that nobody in the room realizes that. And she's corroborated this later by saying things that no one expected her to remember and that they could recall. But one of the things that the anesthesiologist says is she's trying to die on us. And Rana remembers asking herself, is that what I'm trying to do? She recognizes that she's going into shock, and she recognizes she might not survive this. But the intention assigned to it is a bit odd. And she sees this again and again and sees it in something that she's done. So it prevents us from, as she says, turning to face in the same direction of our patients, and instead feel that our reputation, our sense of our own ability rests on defeating whatever bad thing the patient is doing or undergoing. And it's an interesting unconscious effect. Next, I want to say something about confusing data with science, because in the current industrial healthcare system, data has achieved the status of like the pinnacle of scientific thought. And to me, it's really the lowest common denominator. It's useful. It helps us to understand and to perceive patterns that we might not be able to assimilate without organizing the information in the way that data does. But to me, the purest, most fascinating, richest science happens at the frontier between what we know and the vastness of what we don't know. And in fact, when we need a paradigm shift, we have to have some tricks. Sometimes it's through mathematics, like tricking our language processing to get information in a way that defeats logical thought barriers. Or it can mean leaning out into what is unknown and receiving creatively some new piece of information that allows us to shift how we think, or how we consider a problem or a situation. And it can end up undermining lots of things that we've taken for granted that we have known for a long time. That's a paradigm shift. Paradigm shift doesn't happen from what we already know. It has to happen from going to the place of mystery. And yet we have such anxiety about the unknown, or about uncertainty, or about creativity. Even creativity seems kind of like non-scientific. And it is in a way, but this is a problem. The other thing is that data becomes something that anybody can use and manipulate. So maybe it seems like it's important because it allows things like determining the value of care to be assigned by people who aren't in the interior of what the meaning of that care and its outcome actually are to the individual. The next thing I'll say about this idea about data and algorithm-driven medicine is that it underplays or overrides a critical physician attribute. And I think this happens over and over again, that we're called on as physicians for very specific attributes and inclinations that we have, but then also a bit demonized or repressed for them. And this is one example. So we go to medical school and learn basic science so that we have foundations for understanding the principles of how things work, in order that we might both imagine or derive new treatments to things that we don't know how to treat, or understand disease processes that we don't understand, and also to improvise when we don't have a known treatment, as we saw most vividly recently with COVID. And even in the more ordinary way, that when somebody is, the diagnostic data that we get isn't adding up to the pattern as it is in the book. The patient didn't read the book. That we have some ways to still work around those gaps in the pattern to still make a diagnosis. So we call on this all the time, and yet increasingly there's a drive towards algorithmic driven medicine as if it's more accurate or more successful or better than individual physicians with judgment are. Well, I mean, we're trying to satisfy some problems with that as well. I'm not saying that it's not useful in some ways, but it has to be held in balance with these other ideas. So I'll give an example of how this translates to the situation with the rat and the canister. My friend Rose, who's an outstanding evidence-based medicine internist who also embraces and understands holistic medicine practices and uses them on purpose for things that are not well represented in allopathic medicine, has many doctors in her practice as patients. And one of them is a mid-career internist who'd come in feeling low energy and pretty depressed about work and maybe life as well, who relayed the story to her of seeing a new middle-aged man with a new patient, a middle-aged man with first diagnosis of mild to moderate hypertension. He was asymptomatic, and this doctor had the full discussion and workup and then talked with him about treatment options, including lifestyle modifications or medications. The patient strongly preferred a trial of lifestyle modifications, so they mapped out what those would be and planned follow-up and went on their way. About a week later, this doctor was called into his section chief's office and confronted with having not prescribed according to the algorithm for new onset hypertension of this kind. Was given a chance to explain himself. The doctor explained his and the patient's position, and then was told that if he didn't obey the algorithm in the future, he'd be fired. So the doctor is left wondering why he bothered to do all this work, and if that's how things are going to be done, then what's his utility in this role? Anybody could do that. I mean, it's almost like a vending machine. And then he and my friend Rose both presumed that the hospital foundation had received a contribution from the pharma company that made the first drug in the algorithm. So that, again, there's sort of a complex, we'll talk about it in financial security, but money laundering scheme. There's a way of laundering dirty things through the system in a way that still achieve what our principles tell us is not to be, is the whole point of having things in place that to prevent that. It's just phenomenal. Now, whether it's right or not in this particular case isn't so important, because the fact of the matter is these two doctors knew that this kind of thing is happening and shaping what we do. And it's part of this feeling that we all are participating in a system that compromises our principles. And we feel that way because we are. We are participating. Yeah. And we think it's inevitable, but I'm going to suggest to you that it's not. So in this situation, for example, maybe what's in the intellectual stimulation canister isn't so nutritious anymore for the rat. Or maybe the bar is broken, and this rat might go feed on one of the other canisters a bit more. And I didn't really say this out front, so maybe I should pause now and say it, because I should have said it when I first put these up. You know, if something fails in one of the canisters, let's say the bar stops working on meaningful work, the rat's then going to meet its satiety needs by going to the other two canisters. And if a second one fails, then it's going to rely solely on the remaining functional canister. Even if the food goes bad or doesn't taste good, and it will do that, well, until it stops eating. Either it gets sick or it stops eating and it gets sick. So this is, this is how I started to think about balance among the containers, and also what happens when we don't have an open system with free communication among them. Okay, so next, let's turn to financial security. You know, when I started medical school, I had no idea how much money a doctor made. I knew that it was likely that I'd be able to support my family, but I didn't have big aspirations of being rich. I just wanted a satisfying life with enough money that I could take care of things and not be like my mom. I didn't even know how much money surgeons made when I finished my surgery residency. I had no clue. People didn't talk about it, and the internet was just starting to happen, and this wasn't on there. So I also, though, over time have heard doctors talk about maybe being compensated for how much misery we have in our work, what we sacrifice in order to be here, that ought to be compensated financially. Well, to a certain extent, that's done, it seems like, but not really. That's not really what's happening. And most doctors will end up saying, no amount of money would pay for this anyway. I mean, that all gets crystal clear if something happens, like a kid gets sick. Then no amount of money pays for not being with your kid. Like, that gets clear. So I had the idea that we got paid more than some other professions because of the responsibility we take. And then I was married to a man who is a business consultant who made sweeping recommendations, to an industry, but to a particular company, big reforms, change of personnel, change of production processes, all of this stuff. And they had liability insurance, but he never been sued. And he also never had any idea what happened with the recommendations they made. They did their consulting job, they did, and then they walked away. Nobody ever came back to them and said, everything you said failed. That just never happened. And I was blown away because I thought he'd made more money than I had for a long time. It started to catch up once I got sort of more traction in my business, but the thing was, he said, Lauren, people don't get paid for taking responsibility or for being unhappy or sacrificing things. They get paid by the amount of revenue that you generate for the business. Well, I was stunned. I'm still a little stunned, to tell you the truth, even though I believed him then, and I think that's true now. But another thing that I saw happening that seemed to correspond with increasing expectations about income was we're seeing the phenomenal salaries commanded by healthcare executives. Now, a lot of doctors have said, well, if that kind of money is floating around, we want a piece of that. I mean, they're not on the front line doing the work. They're not taking the personal risk. So why aren't we seeing more of that? So here, this is the ground for moral compromise, because this is the beginning of being able to say, we want to recover the downstream revenue from things that we do in this system. I'm not saying that it's wrong for doctors to want to have a comfortable life and to be well enough taken care of that we need to be in order to be able to provide for other people. But this is an interesting phenomenon, and it made me then start to think, well, a lot of people are talking about wealth here, not just financial security. But something is wrong with labeling this canister that way and expecting it to be a source of well-being, because, well, if in any of these, if you lean in it too heavily, things get imbalanced and a little bit weird, because this is like a three-legged stool. If any one of these is missing in the right quantity, something bad happens inside of us and to the people around us. But it did make me ask the question, does money buy happiness? And I think most doctors would say no, even though we end up trying to buy our own happiness with our salary. So I went back to see some of these reviews. I'd heard about these studies. This is a review from 20 years ago, but these are still largely recognized principles that apply. So there are big correlations between the wealth of nations and the mean report of subjective well-being of people within them. And those, the wealth of a nation seems to wash out some of the impact of personal income. So in poorer societies, that matters more. You get more incremental increase in reports of subjective well-being in a poor country with a higher salary than in a wealthier country. That when there's economic growth in economically developed societies, there's very little rise in social well-being with the next increments of growth, and variable outcomes with increase in individual outcomes. So there's an inconsistent relationship, but not a uniform relationship between improving social well-being or subjective well-being with rises in personal income as there's economic growth in your society. But importantly, people who prize material goals more than other values tend to be substantially less happy unless they are rich, which is an interesting thing to think about, because to me, being rich by definition means it's not a dollar amount. You're among an elite group, a small group of people who make a lot more money than other people do. So that's an impossible situation. That means that if you're going to set out to get happy by being rich, that you have a big risk of being in this group of people who are less happy, and a small chance of being one of the few really rich people. Well, getting ready for this talk, I also found a more recent study that suggested that the income happiness correlation tends to get higher when both the GDP per capita and the income inequality are high. And it tends to get lower when the GDP per capita and or income inequality are low. So this does argue that when there are discrepant salaries like we see in the healthcare system, that people can be more attached to their personal income as a remedy or a source of happiness. So then I thought, well, this isn't really working. I need to think of something different to put in this canister, something broader that made more sense to me in terms of what seems to actually make people happy. Because it's not the absolute amount of money. There's a bit of a trap in that. And we watch this happen, that people get less and less happy, maybe more prone to burnout, even when salaries are higher than they were. And still are saying, I didn't sign up for this. It almost doesn't matter how much money you get, you didn't sign up for this. So I started to think about prosperity. And I thought about prosperity particularly in the terms of having some abundance. And I like that definition that says abundance is when you have enough to take care of yourself and your family and a little bit more to give away. So this also got me involved in some of these conversations about incentivizing doctors, and even fairly progressive organizations like the Commonwealth Foundation about 10 years ago were having a Twitter conference about how to incentivize physicians to participate in value-based care measures. And this is an organization that would arguably be critical of the amount of the healthcare dollars spent was allocated to physician salaries. And yet all they could come up with in this conversation were financial incentives. I kept trying in my little tweets, you know, my 130 characters or whatever it is, to say, doctors want time. Doctors want sense of community with the people they work with. Doctors want predictability in a schedule. I mean, there were lots of things that we could use, and none of them made it into the conversation. And at the bottom of all of this is this underlying dilemma of profiting from misfortune, which is a sort of ethical dilemma that we really don't know how to talk about very much. And I think our failure to talk about this, as well as that emotion, it's not about the money, that to be in a more vital relationship with, a more explicit conversation about these things, is partly how we bring them from the shadow and into clarity so that we can be making decisions rather than just responding to things and being moved by things in a less conscious way. All right, so now we've talked about prosperity. We've talked about intellectual stimulation. Let's go to meaningful work for a moment. So a lot of us had these ideals that were very motivating to us to overcome all of the hurdles that we had to do to even be an applicant to medical school, much less be accepted. And I've had to think about these a lot because it's not something that we talk about. And I started to think about this myself as a sacred intention, that it almost lives in me in that place. And I've also spoken to people over the years about how a career in medicine felt like it gave me a seat at the table of life. I talked with an in-law of a close friend at a holiday dinner some years ago, maybe about 10 years ago, about this. And he said that's what he wanted. And he thought he would get that being a minister, but lots of times he felt like, I mean, he was burnt out. A lot of the times it felt like people just lived however they wanted, came to him for absolution, and then went and did the same things again. And it felt like he was on a treadmill of his own. But I also had the sense, and I'm sure he would too if I pressed him some more, that we're in the presence of the numinous often in our work, whether it's how everybody comes together at a code, whether it's the birth of a baby and the first time you hear them cry, whether it's somebody who's come in with a traumatic injury and you do an operation and you stop the bleeding, or you do a big cancer operation and you feel like you got to the problem and that you've given the person a fighting chance. You know, at the core of all of these things is also some desire to bend destiny, to be chosen, to be gifted with wisdom and skills that allow us to intercede at times when a disaster is unfolding and to change the course of events. That's why I call it bending destiny. there are more ideas like this. But when we come up against things in our training that cause us to feel overwhelmed or overmatched, we can start to doubt our sanity. We can start to doubt the sanctity of these ideas. They can seem naive or childish. And to be sure, a lot of the people who've been on the same bumpy road and not traveled well will have that attitude on our behalf. Or maybe we get overmatched and somebody just says, it's just poor luck, kid. It's not really sufficient, kind of in the spiritual realm, to help us navigate these difficult things and still feel like we can carry on, or that our faith hasn't been tested. Now, I'm using some of that language even though I don't come out of a religious background at all, but I just find these things to be some of this language helps to characterize really what's happening. So there is in this category too, just so that we don't make the mistake of thinking these other ones have bad things in them and this one doesn't, there is a shadow side to the meaningful work part too. And that's what Roshi Joan Halifax, who was a medical anthropologist before she was the abbot of the Upaya Zen Center, discusses as Ed states. I first came back into acquaintance with her work after she had been a visiting scholar at the National Library of Congress to study burnout. And Roshi Joan does not believe in the term burnout or even compassion fatigue, which I thought was a nicer, kind of more sensitive expression of what happens. She thinks of empathic overload. And by that, what she means is that there are altruistic qualities that we can have that in the right measure are constructive. But if we get overly involved in them, can then fall off an edge and become more pathological. So she would think of pathological empathy, which sounds like a contradiction in terms, but I think this might be right. And this condition happens when we become over-identified with the people that we're taking care of and not humble, not grounded in our own personal experience and intention, when we can lose our way in these things. And this also corresponds with very interesting study that I had read by a forensic psychologist or psychiatrist in the UK who was seeing doctors early on in the discussion about disruptive physicians, and noted, in contradistinction to all of the reports saying this is a patient safety issue, that these were often the most conscientious physicians in the hospital. And I started to put that together with what Roshi Joan Halifax had to say, to see that in that state of being over conscientious, over identified with outcomes, it can be hard to step back and to not have unrealistic expectations about what everybody can achieve or what you can achieve in the situation, given what you have to work with too. So I'll just throw that in here as an important, really interesting, and I think much more satisfying domain for considering what happens when meaningful work, like when altruism, when humanism, that it has a shadow aspect too. It can go too far. All right, now I'm going to turn briefly to a personal experience. Because I think it's still a habit of mine, even though I talk a lot about things that I have thought about over the many years, I kind of tend to write myself out of the script and to say what my process has been. I mean, I started, as you could hear, with my master's thesis decades ago, asking some of these questions. But when I talk about 10 years ago, there was a pivot that happened, and the pivot was that I had tried some different practice settings and done well in them. I had $1 million a year practice 4 years in my practice in Alaska alone, which is not a small thing. I'd hired a junior surgeon, but she wasn't really ready to stay. Things were going to change. And I realized that I wanted to be a better doctor than I felt like I was. I still had more work to do on my own confidence. And so I subspecialized to narrow the scope and narrow and deepen the scope of my practice, which took 5 years and another couple $100,000, but was totally worth it. And now 10 years ago, I was about 5 years into working as an academic subspecialty surgeon. I had retooled, doing two clinical fellowships and 1 research fellowship. And I had a pretty good working relationship, I thought, with my boss. I mean, our office doors were 6 inches apart, and it was common for him on any day that I was sitting there when he was leaving for him to stop in and tell me about his day, what hadn't gone well, what he was pissed off about in the hospital, but even personal things. I mean, a couple of weeks before this happened, he'd been in my office talking about what gift to give his prospective son-in-law as a wedding present. And there were some special circumstances about this marriage and the histories of the 2 kids that I knew because I thought we were friends. So I got a call from him at 11 o'clock one night, must have been after 11 because I was already in bed, saying we had an important meeting the next morning at 8 a.m. I had to be there. It wouldn't be pleasant. I shouldn't say anything, and we would figure it out afterwards. So I went to the meeting, and it was as he said that it would be. But what was being proposed was so outside the realm of anything I'd ever heard that I did have to ask some questions because it wasn't even conceivable to me how or why this would work. And when the meeting ended, we crossed the short distance to his office, and the door hadn't yet closed when this happened. And basically, he started by shouting at me, "Can't you ever shut the fuck up?" That was his opening remark. So I froze where I was. Maybe I closed the door behind me. And then he said, "I've been trying to get you fired for a year." He's getting redder. Neck veins are standing out. He's shaking. And spittle is flying as he's talking. And I then wait more. And he goes on to say, "The chairman won't let me." And then he says, "If you don't sign a non-renewal letter for your contract," and I hadn't even really remembered that my contract was up for renewal in a few months, which would expire in the subsequent year. He said, "If you don't sign a non-renewal letter, I will fucking destroy you." And I remember thinking, what would that look like? What could he actually do? Because I didn't really feel so destructible. I tend to live a pretty open life. And so I didn't think there were things that he could say about me really that might destroy me. But I just remember standing there thinking that. Well, in just a few minutes, I learned 3 important things. One was that I wasn't safe. The second was that I wasn't fireable. And the third was that he was losing his mind. I mean, this is somebody who had told me himself that that the front desk folks in an OR at a previous institution had called the police on him when he'd lost his mind about a schedule problem. And I didn't really believe him. And somebody else had told me that he'd spit on people, although the spittle flying here, I could believe. Well, then he went on to say, and after this conversation, you're going to meet with the CMO because somebody reported you for saying fuck in the clinic. And it was true. I had said fuck in the clinic, but it was more like, what the fuck? Not like, fuck you, the way this guy was saying. And I remember looking down at the floor obliquely and saying to him rather quietly, "Do you think it's odd that I'm going to see the CMO for using language that you're using right now with me?" Which I didn't think there was a further escalation that could happen based on how angry he was, but there was, but it effectively ended the meeting. When I went to see the CMO, I was pretty shaken, as you can imagine. I also didn't know what he knew. Was he in on this plan? It just wasn't clear. I hadn't had time to sort it out. But when I walked in, Lee, who was this avuncular, lean, older internist, was standing at his credenza, and he turned around and he looked at me. He's like, "You, Lauren, you're one of the good ones. What's going on?" So was this a good cop, bad cop? Or was he just telling me the truth about how he saw me? Because this is how most people saw me. And it's how I saw myself, which could be delusional, but I don't think it was. And I think I said a few things because clearly there were things that were bothering me. I didn't know a doctor who didn't have things that were bothering them, but I hadn't felt like quitting. I'd been looking for another position because I wanted to be in New York mostly, but I wasn't in a big hurry because there was enough that was working about where I was that I could stay. Well, I couldn't really speak clearly, and so I suggested to Lee that I make a list of what was on my mind and come back to talk to him because it occurred to me maybe he could help me. So over the next few days at home, I made a list, handwritten, of everything, big and small, like the smallest, most minute things to huge systemic things that I felt were interfering with my happiness, my satisfaction with my work as a doctor. I'm not sure. I guess I should reread it now. I did reread it recently, but whether I included things like about what my hopes and expectations were that might not be in line with what was going on, but there's plenty of time for that. Well, my list was 17 handwritten pages. I was shocked. It was a good catharsis, but I thought, I can't show this to him. Now, maybe I could have. Maybe he would have helped me organize it into some categories. But I also didn't really think my list, even though I didn't think I could show it to him, was all that different from stuff any doctor would say if you gave him a pen and a piece of paper and enough time to write it down. So I had a difficult problem then because a normal thing to do at that point would have been to take a job at another institution, maybe in more of a leadership role. That's what a lot of my friends and colleagues were telling me to do, and that I'd have more control over my little microcosm. But here's what I knew. That list I made, that list was going on everywhere. That wasn't just my institution. And I might have a different cast of characters and feel better about things day by day. Surely I would have. But I wasn't sure how long it would last and whether I'd be having this problem again in 2 years or 3 years. I wasn't getting any younger, and that seemed like that could be a problem. Because the other thing that was going to happen wherever I went, especially if I had more of a leadership job, which I wasn't even sure I could do, partly because I was going to be asked to be the face of the system to my colleagues, to patients, and maybe even to the public. And I wasn't so confident about what was happening at the systemic level. In fact, there were lots of things I didn't like. In fact, it had started to seem, although I'm not sure that I could have said this so succinctly then, that some of my best qualities, my wellsprings as a surgeon, were becoming liabilities. And now I would say, frankly, dangerous. Like, I don't think I could say all of the things that I can say now if I were still working in a healthcare system because I'd be fired. It was like this thing of needing to care, but not care too much, being counted on to do that. It was also that I was often called on to be the face of medical authority with my patients, but I had all the accountability, but very little authority over a lot of what was happening within the system. That was a conundrum too, not unlike Rose's patient who tried to keep current and read and make good medical scientist-based judgments about patient care and still got told he'd be fired for doing that. I loved operating and I loved being with patients. I needed to be in a big institution because I liked doing 16-hour cases that took 4 teams. And I liked doing innovative things. I liked being on the forefront with robotic colorectal surgery. So the conundrum for me was that I couldn't stay and I couldn't leave because it was going to be pretty much the same everywhere. So, and I knew that some things were happening inside of me, even though I didn't feel disengaged or despondent or unwilling to help and be engaged. I was, if anything, sort of trying to make that happen more and call on people through writing and other things to be involved. So I was having what Jungian James Hollis would call an appointment with myself. And after a while, I decided that my best option was going to be to try to make a better place to do surgery. And so I conceived of a sabbatical year as a visiting scholar at another institution where I could create a business plan for a concierge care surgical unit as a proof of concept. I mean, concierge care doesn't answer things for everybody, but at least I thought I could develop some of these ideas. And the main ideas were that I wanted to work in a place that supported my well-being and that of the other providers of care in the same ways that we support patients, built on an idea of reciprocity and what we give and receive. That's not just financial. Well, lots of things happened along the way. And the next list that I made to get ready for that was a list of all the things that I found to be ordinary but vexing day by day kind of feeling state problems. And then I organized that list into this acronym, first aid: failure, fatigue, isolation, which could be invisibility, regret, responsibility, which is also part of isolation, stress, sorrow, trauma, a lot of things. And I told a good friend of mine, I'd like to write a workbook about this and have some possible remedies, some ways of metabolizing what's on this list. And he was like, Lauren, who's going to want to read this book? I mean, this is a tough list. And I had to agree because I was having a hard time working with it and writing about it. But as I looked at the list, I also realized that part of why it felt so tough is that I didn't really have a lot to say about many of the things on here. I didn't have a lot of strategies for metabolizing this stuff or thinking about it even explaining what it is. I did recognize something that Dan Siegel, you can tell I like Dan Siegel, said, which is you have to name it to tame it. So I could see that even being in a state and being able to say, oh, I'm feeling insignificant, I'm feeling like what I do doesn't matter, that could help take some of the sting out of it and be the beginning of processing it. But I wanted to be able to do more. And as I looked at that and thought about doing more, I started to think of these things as like a missing curriculum. And that was really the birth of Metamorphosis Medicine, although I didn't have that name in mind at the time. Once I started to think about a missing curriculum, I, of course, thought about the hidden curriculum. And, you know, the hidden curriculum being the milieu that we get immersed in once we start our clinical training, and that has been blamed for sapping the compassion from idealistic medical students and also for burnout and other not so good things. But I started to think, well, maybe the hidden curriculum is what fills the void left by the missing curriculum. And maybe a lot of what's in there are default responses to stuff that's on this list that are either habitual, old and outmoded, or just dysfunctional adaptations. And that if we had these things, maybe that wouldn't control things quite so much. And then I started to see all the little things that we could make here as being like small medicines or tonics. And then I started to think about medicine school. And it really shifted how I thought about medicine, not healthcare, not providers, about something very different. And it started to validate the ways in which we need to take care of ourselves, how we need to attend to things. You know, we have not very good strategies for tackling some of the most common and expensive medical problems: obesity, hypertension, diabetes. But even though we don't have really great ways to treat those things, we don't tell those people, well, too bad, too sad for you, it's a personal problem. Or, I mean, sometimes we say things like that, or we think it's characterologic, but we don't stop looking for solutions. We do that with ourselves all the time. Like, these are character flaws, our ability or inability to reconcile with all of this. Well, I just thought we could do better. So I want to get back to this idea about bending destiny, bending fate. You know, what if some of these ideas that inspired us to come here didn't just originate in us as naivete or as a response to helplessness that we felt with ill family members, or just from behavioral things in our own families, or out of ancestral need to compensate for people who died in the Holocaust or other things that we need to signify that we have respect and that we've made it and that we've made good use of the life that we're given. What if these are things that actually are almost at an instinctual level that just resonate more strongly in some of us than others, that really drive us, and that we need to pay attention to that, and that failing to pay attention to that is like starving us. And then I had this other thought about what medicine promised me, what I like about it. And that is the possibility every day of distilling out of abstraction down into the very concrete, present in front of me, physical reality of a patient. Whether it's distilling out scientific ideas and principles or knowledge, or that more ephemeral, value-driven, cultural ideal-driven things into a particular situation, that opportunity is part of what makes it all real and exciting. And when I saw it that way, I thought, that's not really so different in some ways from what shamans do. I mean, for time immemorial, there have been healers whose job is to address a problem on the material plane, the ordinary plane, by traveling or drawing down from the non-ordinary plane information, wisdom, ideas, practices to try to affect a better outcome here and now. And so maybe this motif of being a shaman, also with power and control and other things, but also the wisdom to place ourselves in the broader scheme of things, to know what the hazards are of overstepping our idea about our own power, that we have a chance to revitalize and to draw on such a vaster knowledge than we do, and to validate our own feelings. Because, this prospect of jettisoning these ideals that we had is also a way of abandoning ourselves. When we abandon our desire and our dreams, we leave ourselves in a state of disappointment, disillusionment, and then we turn to and do other things without the guidance that we need from this. So I want to finish this talk by inviting you into another experience for a few minutes, which is a journey, a walk. And we're going to use soundscape number 2 to help us with this walk. And we're going to have a walk with our younger self. So if you can take a moment to get comfortable, and then maybe close your eyes or soften your gaze and invite younger self to join you on this walk. Really try to conjure a picture of yourself, your younger self, at the time when younger self was dreaming of medical school and becoming a doctor. And as you fall into step together, you've asked younger self to walk with you. You can feel the dirt and rocks, the crunch of dry leaves under your feet, the respiration of the trees, and the sound of birds and other forest animals. And you might ask younger self, do you have anything you'd like to tell me about what you were dreaming and about my work? Younger self might have an answer, but younger self might just walk with you this time. As you come farther down the path, you see a smaller trail veering off to the side, and you and younger self are excited about getting off the main road. And this narrower path is all dirt, and the herbaceous layer under the trees brushes your legs, and the trees are close. And continue to walk along this path together to see where you're taken and to listen to whatever younger self has to say. As you come to the end of your time together with younger self, notice where you are. Have you sat on a rock or a log? Have you come to a clearing in the forest? Perhaps you're next to a stream. And then thank younger self for visiting with you today, reminding you of things and being curious about your life and where you are. And you might ask younger self, could you meet again? Maybe a little bit more often. And know that this little journey, this little pathway is available to you both anytime. And as you return to this space and time on your own, I'll share with you an image that my friend and mentor Phil Newman, who's now 85, took this year of a shaman at Erratic Rock in Oregon. You know, we have so many sources of guidance that we don't even begin to know how to tap. And it's all here for us. But I hope I've succeeded today in sharing with you what these three priorities I think are, which are gifts of medicine: prosperity, intellectual stimulation, and meaningful work, and how and why they can get disturbed or out of balance, and provide a framework for you to begin to look at them, to rebalance them for yourself. Because each physician's personal practice prescription is different. It's going to require different measures of all three things. And that we've also outlined some ways that you can begin to work towards those and even to heal parts of them, like through the missing curriculum. I look forward to any opportunities to meet and talk with any of you about your experience of doctoring, and feel that we have so much excellent work to do that has nothing to do with healthcare economics or the industry that could make our work so much more rewarding and sustainable than it is, and fulfill the original promise to fulfill its sacred intention. Thanks for listening.